What's good, everybody? Welcome back to Cadillac Cartoonz, and today I'm going to show you guys how to refill your Copic markers. So all you'll really need for this video is a Copic marker. I'm using a Copic sketch marker for this video. You can also do this with a Copic Ciao marker, a Copic classic marker, or Copic original as some people call it. And you can also do this with Copic wide markers, which I don't have. But if you're curious on what those look like, I'll put a picture of it on the screen somewhere. But with whatever Copic marker you're trying to refill, you'll also need a corresponding ink refill bottle. So as of 2020, this is what the Copic ink refill bottles look like. And as you can see, it looks very similar to a Copic sketch marker. So here's what the refill ink bottles used to look like. It used to say Copic Varies ink on it and have this specific shape to it. So you can use either bottle, it just has to be the corresponding colored ink to the marker you're trying to refill. In my case, I'm using the Copic color B23. And as you can see, this Copic ink bottle, it has B23 on it as well. So this is the Copic ink that I'll use to refill the ink in this marker. But what you'll also need to refill your Copic markers is a pair of tweezers like this. The Copic brand tweezers have teeth on the ends. Mine are flat, but that's okay. So you're going to need some tweezers, and you may need a paper towel, and I do have some hand sanitizer just in case. Hand sanitizer is basically alcohol, and this is alcohol ink that we're dealing with. So in case we end up making a mess or whatever, we can use this clear alcohol to help us clean up. So you're going to need that, and then maybe a paper towel or tissue or a washcloth, anything to wipe up a mess. So in short, what you're going to need is the marker you're trying to refill, the refill ink, some tweezers, hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol, and something absorbent like a washcloth or a paper towel. But before we get into refilling the Copic markers, I want to first talk to you guys about the inside of a Copic marker, the anatomy of a Copic marker, let you guys see what the inside of a Copic marker looks like so you understand how I'm refilling it or why I'm refilling it the way I'm doing it. So let's get to that, and then we can start refilling our Copic marker. So as you can see, I purposely broke open one of my Copic markers. The color was B91 in case you want to know. And what I did was every single piece that was inside of this barrel, I laid it out here so I can show you guys what it looks like inside of this barrel here. So as you guys may or may not know, Copic markers have a brush tip on one side and a chisel tip on the other side, and then we have a little tube here. I'm going to refer to that as a sponge because when we go to refill our Copic markers, we'll be dropping the ink directly into this absorbent sponge here, and then when we drop the ink into this sponge here, it'll then get absorbed into both of these nibs here, because as you can see, the stems of each of these nibs that are inside of the marker that we can't see, it pokes into this sponge, and then it absorbs all the ink that's in that sponge, so that way we can use either the brush tip or the chisel tip on the Copic marker. So let me actually grab the brush tip, and as you can see, the stem of that brush tip, it pokes into that sponge, so whatever ink is in this sponge, it gets absorbed into the brush tip. Same with the chisel tip because it also has a stem. But eventually the ink from this sponge, it'll run out and it'll then show in one or both of the nibs of the marker, and that's a clear indication that it's time to refill it. But yeah, that's what the inside of a Copic marker looks like. So now let's get to refilling our marker, and when I say refill, I mean dropping ink directly into this sponge, and then both of the nibs soak up that ink so that way we can use the marker. Okay, so now I have my B23 Copic sketch marker, and I also have the corresponding refill ink bottle B23, so now I can get to refilling my Copic marker. But before I get to refilling it, I just want to specify the amount of ink that I'm dropping into this marker. So before making this video, I did some research, and according to the Copic website, it says that a refill ink bottle like this, it can refill a Copic sketch marker 7 times. So in this refill ink bottle, there's 12 milliliters to it. So what I did was I took 12 and divided it by 7. 12 divided by 7 is 1.7, and that rounds up to 2. right? So I can put 2 milliliters worth of ink into this Copic marker, and 2 milliliters worth of ink would be right about here to this line, right? Because I'll be holding this refill bottle like this when I go to insert the ink into that marker. So I'm gonna refill the ink until it runs down to this line, specifically the third line from the bottom, basically. Alright, so that's just my estimation. I'm gonna put 2 milliliters worth of ink into this Copic marker, right? So now we can get to actually putting the ink in the marker. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take off the chisel tip, right? Making sure I got the chisel end. I'm gonna take my tweezers and I'm gonna pull that nib out, like so. Alright, and now I'm gonna take this refill ink bottle, I'm gonna screw it off, like so. And as you can see, this Copic ink refill bottle, it has like a little nozzle at the end, like so. And every refill ink bottle has this little nozzle too, so you don't have to worry about that. And this refill nozzle is meant to touch the sponge that's inside of this marker. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stick this in, and you should be able to feel it. You should be able to feel that sponge, right? And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pay attention to this line. I'm gonna pay attention to the amount of ink that I'm gonna put into this marker. I'm just gonna squeeze. And you should be able to hear that. I'm not sure what to call it, but you should be able to hear sort of like the sponge is drinking this ink. I know that's a weird thing to say, but you should hear that sound. Okay, I think I put 2 milliliters worth of ink inside already. So now I'm gonna put that off to the side. I'm gonna grab my tweezers again, or if you want to use your hands and touch this nib, that's fine too. But I prefer to use tweezers to avoid any mess. I'm gonna take that nib and shove it in, like so. Alright, and now the chisel tip is on there. It's soaking up all the ink that I inserted into this sponge here. So now I'm gonna give that some time to soak into each nib.
12 seconds later.
Alright, and now after giving each nib time to soak up the ink that's inside of the sponge, I can now try out my Copic marker. And as you can see, it looks as if it's brand new again. There is another way to refill your Copic markers, and I have to say, it's a lot simpler than how I showed you guys how to do it. Another way to refill your Copic markers would be to drop the ink directly onto the nib itself. That's an option, but in my opinion, the only downside to doing that is that not much of that ink gets absorbed into the sponge. Therefore, not much of that ink will be absorbed into the other end of the marker. For example, if I were to drop ink onto the chisel nib of one of my Copic markers, a lot of that ink will be absorbed into the chisel nib. And depending on how much ink you put into the marker, not much of that ink will be absorbed into the sponge that's inside the Copic marker. So let's say you're in the middle of an illustration, or you're in the middle of a project or whatever. You have the option to refill it the way I showed you in this video, but if you're in a hurry or whatever, you can drop the ink onto the nib that you want to use for the time being, and then once you're finished with your illustration or project or whatever, you can refill the entire marker properly, the way I showed you in this video. And speaking of video, that's it. That's how you refill Copic markers. So if you liked the video, or if you found it useful, give it a like and a comment, subscribe if you haven't, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And I'll see you in my next video.